Yeah, it was like recent. You okay there? Happy to do that too. All right. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you all for coming out. Very excited to have you join us tonight for a presentation by Dr. Carolyn Kennedy from Texas A&M University, who's going to be presenting on the project that she directed in 2014, 15, and 16, and the results of the examination of the Steamboat Shipwrecks located just off the shore there south of the Shelburne Shipyard. Carolyn is an expert in steamboat technology and the evolution of steamboat technology, who I've had the great pleasure of working with since 2012, when Carolyn attended one of our field school opportunities that we presented here at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. And there's nothing more fulfilling professionally than having someone that was once, I'm going to call her a student, even though that was a bit of mine, who then not only goes on to continue her career, a very successful career in nautical archaeology, but then also is excited about working in this area again and bringing work back to Lake Champlain and the region, and continuing to expand our knowledge of steamboats and other nautical themes around Lake Champlain. So very excited to have Carolyn present to us today, and look forward to working with her for many years in the future as well. So thank you very much, and let's give a welcome to Carolyn.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you all for coming. I'm so excited to have such a nice turnout. This is, as Chris mentioned, this was my PhD dissertation project that I'll be talking about tonight. But I have worked with Chris for a long time on various different things, but this is really, like you said, kind of my sweet baby here. So let me talk to you a little bit about the Steamboat Shipwrecks of Shelburne Shipyard here. First things first, I don't really need to tell you where Lake Champlain is with the following talks. But I will tell you its importance in the steam industry, which may not be known to everyone here. So in 1807, a man named Robert Fulton, who you may have heard of, he launched the first commercially successful steamboat on the Hudson River, just south of here. And that was called the Clermont, or the North River Steamboat. And then, seeing the success opportunity in front of him, he very quickly secured a monopoly for steamboat construction on the Hudson River, which meant that anybody else who wanted to build steamboats and operate steamboats for passenger service had to find somewhere else to build those steamboats. So a couple of enterprising young brothers, the James and John Winans, looked north to Lake Champlain, and in 1809 they built the second commercially successful steamboat in the world, called the Vermont, in 1809. Following their great success, lots of people saw dollar signs, and a couple more steamboats were soon to be launched. One of those was, in 1815, was the Phoenix, the first Phoenix, little spoiler there. And then the reason for Lake Champlain being such a successful place for steamboating, especially passenger steamboating, which is like taking a ferry these days, right? 120-mile lake, north-south orientation, basically part of the water highway that connects the St. Lawrence River, so Montreal, Quebec City, to the Hudson River, just a little hop, skip, and a jump over Lake George, then back over the Hudson River, and straight down to New York City. So big metropolises connected via water highway, 120 miles of which you could take a steamboat, a beautiful steamboat that's kind of like the old style airplanes that you'd get dressed up to go on board and sit and have a nice cocktail. You could ride down the lake. At the beginning, took a little more than a day, and then later on they got a little faster. So, all this to say, Lake Champlain played a very important part in the role of steamboats development throughout the early 19th century. But what was that development like? So, steamboats get a lot of flack for not being the most exciting type of vessel, but they are. They're the most exciting. And so, why are they the most exciting? This was my research question. Steamboats, 1807. People have been using vessels of all different kinds on the water to transport long distances for literally thousands of years, right? We know that the Aborigines made it to Australia like something like 40,000 years ago on boats. How did they get there? They were sailing. They were relying on the wind. They might have been paddling short distances or rowing short distances too, but for the most part they're relying on the wind. And so they have a very specific way of building boats in order to harness the power of the wind to propel a hull of a boat in the direction they want to go. Okay, so if you think about a modern steamboat here, we've got a fore and aft sail, right? So something's positioned kind of longitudinally along the same axis as the boat itself. And that wind is going to hit the side of that sail. And for it to go forward, you want something really deep in the water that will provide lateral resistance. Because otherwise, if the wind hits the side of the sail, you don't have something with lateral resistance, it'll just go to the side. So you need something with lateral resistance to propel that wind forward, to kind of change its direction and push the boat forward, right? Now, suddenly you have steamboats. 1807, you get the first steam engine on a wooden hull to work. You're burning a fire in the middle of a wooden hull, it's its own thing. But now, you don't have to worry about this wind so much, but you're having paddle wheels that are literally pushing the water backwards, right, with these things called buckets at the end of the spokes here. They're pushing the water backwards in order to propel the hull forward, which is great, but this means really interesting things for the shipwrights who are building the hulls of these boats, because before they had these nice wine glass shaped hulls that allowed that deep, deep lateral resistance and then these deep keels. Now, you don't need that. You're pushing the water backwards. You have nothing to do with moving that wind forward or whatever. And so they have this opportunity to really experiment with hull design. And if you've ever asked a shipwright if they enjoy experimentation, I suspect they're going to say no. Imagine if you're a shipwright and you experiment, what is the result of your disastrous experiment? It's a lot of money and possibly lives lost. So it was not, they were maybe eager to experiment, but people started to recognize the need for speed. This is the early 1800s. We're approaching the Industrial Revolution. Everything is getting faster. People want to get there on a schedule. And so the idea of maybe improving hulls to a point where they could go really, really fast was desirable and was pushing shipwrights to maybe experiment in different directions. So much so that by the 1830s, so just a couple of decades after the first steamboats, literally, they have done all kinds of experimentation, both in the Hudson River, but also up here on Lake Champlain. And some British engineer came by and did a survey of some of these experiments, and he talked about the speed of these boats being unequaled in speed by those of any other quarter of the globe. This was where it was happening for steamboats. This was like the top level of experimentation for steamboat hull design. The problem for us to understand what was happening is that there was very poor documentation of what they were doing. And there is a reason for that. In many cases, the steamboats were being built, launched, literally maybe 6 months into operation, they'd be pulled out of the water and altered just on the fly. There were no plans, and if there were plans, didn't recognize the ship 6 months later anyway. So we don't have, as historians, we don't have the information from the history books about what these things were looking like. What were these experiments? How were they actually building and experimenting and changing the hull design of these boats? So this is where the project comes in. Out at Shelburne Shipyard, in 1820, the Lake Champlain Steamboat Company actually purchased a plot of land and started their steamboat well, they'd already started their steamboat operations. We're going to skip that part of the history, but they started their steamboat operations at Shelburne in 1820. And they continued to operate there until 1833, when the Lake Champlain Transportation Company, who you may now recognize as Lake Champlain Transportation, bought out their business and started their own steamboat company. Well, they had already started as well, and they just kind of merged and rebranded. And they continued there until now. They're still there. I think. I'm not sure exactly who owns what, but you know, Shelburne Shipyard's still there, so this is where it happened. From 1820 onwards, this is where steamboats lived and operated and ran. And also, what do you do with an old steamboat if it doesn't happen to sink by accident? What do you do with it? They're kind of big, they're a little bulky. Anyway, this is what Shelburne Shipyard looked like in 2014. I keep saying today, and I realize that's 11 years ago. 2014, but it probably looks pretty similar to that today. And, well, what do you do with an old steamboat? This is what it looked like in 1860. This is what you do with them. You kind of just leave them. There's not much you can do with them. So similar to think of like a car mechanic's kind of backyard, where there's all the old cars that they can pull parts from and reuse on the new cars. And it's exactly what they were doing at Shelburne Shipyard. They were leaving these old hulks to just sink. They'd pull anything they could reuse from them, but then once that was all pulled, well, they're out of the way. This is fine. And they'd sink. In some cases, they were purposely sunk, but in many cases, they were just kind of left to rot and fall down on their own. So this is great news for us, those people who want to learn about steamboat development, because in 2013, when I started grad school, Kevin Chrisman, who was my advisor and continues to be my colleague and was the director, my co-director with this project, he talked to me about this fantastic site where he knew that there were steamboats because he had been diving on this site in 1983. So we reached out to Chris Savick and mentioned, hey, we'd love to have a project out at Shelburne Shipyard. What do you think? And Chris immediately went on big maps in 2013 and said, oh, these wrecks? You want to look at these wrecks? Oh, yeah, those wrecks, yeah. So pretty easily attainable at the time. Unfortunately, Big Maps has changed and updated their satellites in 2015. So you can't see it, it's not as clear a day, whatever they're using now. I've checked. But at the time, Chris sent us this image. You can easily see the outlines of 4 distinct vessels, right? And I can, spoiler alert, they're all steamboats. So in 2014, we managed to make it up here for the summer. We launched our first season of 3 looking at these 4 different wrecks in Shelburne Shipyard. And basically to study what I've been talking about, which was how these hulls were changing. Now we have a selection of 4 different steamboats. We didn't know exactly which steamboats they were, but we presumed that they would have been built at different times. And so if we could identify which steamboats these were, we could identify what dates they were built, and then maybe observe what the changes were from 1 through 4, right? So that was our goal. And in order to do so, we had to get into the water and actually record the timbers and look at the dimensions of all those timbers and the lengths and sizes of the hulls. So that was plan A from 2014, so that's what we did. 2014, we came up with what we call site plans for each one of these wrecks. And so that was basically the outline with detailed measurements with measuring tapes, clipboards, pencils, writing down every timber size and dimension. And we didn't get super detailed that year. We were there for 3 weeks with 10 people and managed to get this much information, which is pretty good. So we were able to come up with kind of the sizes of each. Here you can see them a little bit more clearly. Here's Rec 1, and these are scaled to each other, so they're all the same scale. You can see they actually just happened to line up in order of size. So Rec 1 is the smallest, and we have Rec 2, Rec 3, and Rec 4 here. Rec 4 is behemoth, 214 feet long. Then it was a matter of trying to identify what these 4 were to see if we could come up with like a timeline for which one was built first, next, third, fourth, to see what the evolution looked like. So, first thing we went to was our historical sources, anything we had that was information about this part of the shipyard. So Shelburne Shipyard is pretty big. You can kind of see it in the outline here, right? So this is the dry dock up here now. I think this is like the shipyard building. Basically, there's some docks over here. This is the concrete dock here at the ASCII Marina. And then Pine Point's down here. And you can see in 1980, actually, excuse me, that's the wrong date. This map came out of the Champlain Transportation Company archives. It says on the map as early as 1880. It was definitely later than that, and I can give you reasons for that in a minute. But it gave you an idea that there might have been up to 13 different wrecks out here. We know for sure that at least 7 of these are true, that there were 7 wrecks out here, but very possible there were more. We don't know when this map was made, we don't know who made this map, but it was one of the things we had to go on, so I used it. But we were only really looking, this image, this satellite image, is just this section of the bay. So we're going to ignore the rest of this for this talk. That's a lot of steamboats. So we'll talk about these, but you can see very clearly 4 steamboats, 1, 2, 3, 4. And over here, there's supposed to be 5. So right off the bat, we have a problem. Which ones are these? Which of the 5? If the 5 are even the right ones. Spoiler alert, they're not. So wrecks 3 and number 4 over here, these ones were actually the easiest to identify because they did line up with this map. And we had a number of other historical sources, including some books, some articles, things like that, that mentioned these 2 boats, the Whitehall and the Burlington, were abandoned in the old Shelburne Shipyard next to each other with their bows pointing together. So this matches very well with those 2. When we looked at the sizes of the wrecks, so the dimensions as we had planned, we found that wreck 3 here was 158 feet long of what remained, but it was missing its bow. It had been driven right up into shore, so the ice over time washed the bow away. And so that was an easy missing from the 185 feet original size of Burlington. So that fit just fine. And then wreck number 4, like I said, huge, 214 feet long, but we had the stern post and we had the stem, the bow and the stern. So we had basically the full length. And that one matched very well with Whitehall, which was supposed to be 215 feet from historical sources. So perfect, right? Beautiful. Lines up, lovely. Those are easy to identify. We know the dates for when they were built. They were built actually 1 year apart, 1837 for Burlington and 1838 for Whitehall. Very good narrow window for looking at some experimental designs within a year of each other. Okay, so we've got numbers 4 and 3. What about these 3 or 2 that we have left? How are we going to identify our Rec 1 and Rec 2 when there are 3 different options according to this map that has maybe a sketchy source? So we weren't sure. We thought maybe we'd check dimensions, but before we even got around to that, because we hadn't even finished recording, one of our divers, and I'm not even sure, was this you, Chris? Did you find this plate?
Well, I never did find it.
One of our divers, I don't remember who, found this plate fragment right inside of Rec 1. Now, that may be telling, but keep in mind that this is a very active marina and has been active continuously since 1820. This is very close to shore. Probably had boats on top of it. This could have been dropped on top of it any time in the existence of this marina. It was just sitting on top of it. But it also could have been with the wreck. There's no reason it couldn't have been. It's just we couldn't tell. But this has a beautiful thing called a maker's mark right on the bottom. Very quick internet search on somebody's phone, literally that same minute that somebody brought it up, found the maker's mark online. It belonged to Burgess and Campbell, and this specific design was 1871 to 1890 for that company. So that put us into a time of one of the wrecks on this map, which it was the A. Williams, which was one of the ones supposedly here, right? Number 5 is here. A. Williams built in 1870. Lines up very nice timeline-wise. But we weren't necessarily convinced until one of our friends and historians brought over this picture that happened to be pre-labeled with this hull sitting here. This one's clearly not. The A. Williams is labeled down here. It's the Vermont. But something is here. And if you look at that satellite image, you can see it's just directly right next to shore, like Rec 1. Somebody had done this long before we arrived on the scene. Fit pretty well. And when we looked at the dimensions, those also added up. Oops, sorry. So Rec 1, we determined this is probably A. Williams. Okay, we'll take it. Okay, so now we have 1 wreck left, and we have 2 other options. So we figured, let's just figure out, based on dimensions, which one it fits most closely with. Now, for Rec 1, 2, and 4, we had, as I mentioned for Rec 4, the stern and the stem. So we had almost the full extent, okay? So we had the full size. We had a very good idea of the size. We know this is not A. Williams with these 3, because we've already gotten that one with Rec 1 here. So the last 2 are Francis Saltus, which was built in 1844, which fits the timeline of Burlington and Whitehall, right? It's not too far away from those chronologically. 185 feet. Franklin was built in 1827, a little bit earlier, but pretty close in terms of timeline. Burlington and Whitehall, 162 feet. Our Rec 2 is 134 feet. Doesn't fit either of those steamboats, we've got the whole thing just about, I mean, you know, listen, we're talking about the length of the bottom, right? All we have left is very much the bottom of these boats, okay? So if you think about a vessel, what we have is just the bottom. So we're maybe missing a couple feet in the bow where the raking bow comes up, and we're maybe missing a couple feet in the stern where the stern's kind of at an angle. So we can say, let's say up to like 140, pushing 145, but like really 145 would be absolutely the max that this could be stretched to with 134 length remaining. Okay, so let's go back to the drawing board. We don't know what wreck this is. There's our missing lengths in the bow and stern there. This first season, we had George Schwartz, who is currently with the Naval History and Heritage Command, a colleague of ours, who happened for his dissertation to study another steamboat in Lake Champlain, the historically famous Phoenix I, which sank catastrophically in the middle of the lake. Its location of sinking was very well known and famous because it was a catastrophic event. And so he studied that for his dissertation a few years earlier than I started mine. And this was the site plan for Phoenix I, and he came out, you heard we were working on steamboats, so he came out for a couple days, dove on all of the wrecks, and when he was on wreck 2, he said, wow, this looks a lot like Phoenix, right? I said, oh yeah, he's like, yeah, I bet this is an earlier boat. I said, oh, okay. And if you look at it, you can see what he means. So I'll just explain this site plan here. This is the center line. This is what we call the keelson, kind of the counterpart sandwich bread to the keel that's underneath all those cross frames, right? And so that's the keelson center line. And these are the frames that cross it. The port side of this wreck was really, really buried in rocks. So we did not, in that first season, get a good look at what was under the rocks, except what was kind of proud or above the rocks. And those were what we call these longitudinal timbers. These are the engine bed timbers. They're specific to steamboats, and they were these big, massive timbers that were there to support the engine, which were really heavy. They didn't want those sitting on the frames, on the structural components that made up the hull. They had these extra engine bed timbers that helped support that. So all of the steamboats had them, but they were all configured differently. Except if you look at Phoenix I and Wreck 2, you'll see that they actually line up like exactly the same. Not true with the other ones. If you look at the frames, they're very similar as well. And the lengths, 133 foot 9 inches and 134 feet. They're literally 3 inches different. So very telling, right? So we thought, well, maybe this is the second Phoenix. There was a Phoenix 2. Phoenix 2 was built to replace the sunken Phoenix 1, and historical records mention it was built to resemble in every way its predecessor. Well, okay, this looks exactly like it. Then we went to what I used as basically my Bible for my whole dissertation. This is the Ogden Ross Steamboats of Lake Champlain book, wonderful book. And he had listed all of these dimensions of all of the steamboats that ever operated on Lake Champlain. Unfortunately, it was a little disheartening when we read Phoenix 2 was 150 feet. We had a wreck that was 134 feet. Trying to stretch it to 150 feet made it look real funky. It was just off. It didn't quite fit. So in 2014, and it also, additionally, not on our list. Wasn't on this anonymously jarred map. Not there. No Phoenix. So in 2014, we decided it wasn't that one. We thought, okay, but there's a couple others that were built around this time. Maybe it's one of those. Okay, so let's explore other avenues, and we did. And we found on our list, there was one called the Winooski, built in 1832, so pretty contemporaneous with the others. And its length was 136 feet, and that seemed real reasonable to us. So 136 feet matches our length of 134 feet pretty closely. Right around the same time period as the Burlington and Whitehall. That seems to make sense that they would be all sunk around the same time in the same area, right? Kind of section that area off. Okay, so this is the Winooski. 2015, we go back, our second season. We bring with us our friend Kotaro Yamafune, who is now like the world's expert at photogrammetry, this thing where you stitch a bunch of photos together to create 3D models around the world for underwater shipwrecks. He does this all over the world. And so he did this beautiful, this is just the ortho photo, so this is just kind of like a still taken from many, many, many photos that have been pieced together. because it's 134 feet by like 30 feet wide. You could never see this in the visibility that Lake Champlain gives you in such clarity, unless you did it the way you did, which was to stitch those photos together in some software program. We won't get into that too much. And this is what it looked like in 2015. And then in 2015 and 2016, we did some excavations in order to get a better sense of the structural workings of the hull. I'll learn a lot more about this wreck. And this is what the final result was in 2016. This is kind of everywhere we had excavated. You can see the bow section, a couple of frame sections throughout the hull here that have been cut away, and then the stern as well. This gave us like a spread of the hull overall. If you remember, it was covered in rocks. So this was a hefty excavation just to get those sections. Coda also went ahead and did photogrammetry of all of the wrecks, but wreck 2, because it was the most intriguing because of this mystery, he did the most in-depth photogrammetry, and that we also scaled so that the models, the 3D models that we have and that are available online, I'm happy to share, we can actually go in and measure timbers because they've been scaled. So we can use them for scientific research now, in addition to our hand drawings. The others have not been scaled, so they're beautiful visuals and they're relatively correct, right? You know that the stern is this way and the frames are in relative order, but if you wanted to go in and take measurements, it wouldn't necessarily be perfect or accurate. But they're beautiful representations of what's on the bottom, something that you can't really see because the visibility is never much more than 10 feet out there. All right, but back to our mystery, right? So we're still working on Wreck 2. You can see by the time 2016 finished, we excavated a lot of it. But in the early 2015 stage, we realized something very quickly. We started to look at the beam, the width, and the beam on the well-preserved side. Once we started to excavate the port side, we realized that the rocks had actually preserved the hull very well. So as we removed them, we started to see things like the turn of the bilge, which gave us a really good and accurate kind of beam or half beam, which we could then multiply by 2 to get full beam. So half beam, 12 foot 9 inches, great. Except when doubled, it was way more than the beam of Winooski. So Winooski, out the window. Okay, now what boat is this? 2015, we've been 2 seasons on this boat. We've identified the other 3 easily. 2015, we managed to get a big grant from the National Park Services that allowed me to spend my summer up here. And after our field season ended, we got a lot of data from the wreck itself. I was able to spend my days actually here in the museum looking at the Peter Barranco archives. Peter Barranco was the big historian of the lake. He collected tons and tons of paperwork about all of the wrecks on the lake, but definitely the steamboats as well. And what he had in his collection, which literally at the time had just been donated, and so was in boxes that were unorganized, and I'm sure the museum has done a lot more with it now. That was, again, 10 years ago now. But what I managed to find were these certificates of registry for the steamboats of Lake Champlain. Not all of them, but he had a lot of them. So this is what was sent to the state in order to register the passenger steamboats with the state. When you say, oh, we're going to transport passengers up and down the lake. Here they are. These were the official documents that reported what these steamboats looked like and what they were, and their general dimensions. So, still curious about this Phoenix 1 and Wreck 2 dimension. As soon as I saw the Phoenix 2 certificate of registry, I thought, let's take a look at this one a little more closely. I know that Phoenix 2, according to Ogden Ross, is 150 feet long. That just doesn't fit. But this one is still sneaky suspicion in the back of our minds, right? It seems to fit so well in every other way. Take a look at this certificate of registry, which obviously you can't read in this way, but if you look at it closely under light, you can see that here, this actually, I'm going to hold this really still. This word here is Phoenix in cursive, so I brought that up there. And down here you can see 1820 to 1821. Okay, 1820 to 1821. So I know it's the second Phoenix. I'm not talking about that first one. And down here are the dimensions. 143 feet. He was off by 7 feet. He rounded up. Which puts this within range of 134 feet extended to its deck. So wow, okay. Now, I go to a conference right after finding this, early 2016. We're going in for our last season, and 2 weeks before we go into our last season, go to a conference and I say, I think we found the Phoenix 2. We'll probably never know for sure, right? We've been through 2 years of doubt about what this boat could be. We'll probably never know for sure. So we're a couple weeks into our final season. We're still recording. We're excavating more sections to get a good look at the hull of this boat. And one of our divers comes up with this collection of tools. We've found the engine room. And what we found is they left behind a lot of stuff. It's just like anywhere else, people leave garbage everywhere, right? So if it's a tool that wasn't really worth. So one of our divers comes up with this collection of hand tools. You can see a couple cool things, a washer, a couple little bolts, just this iron spare bar stuff. There's a chisel, and we think this might be like some kind of weird drill bit. Not really sure what that is, to be honest. And so I'm happen to be sitting here on the dock where he's putting these up on Charlie's dock. And we're looking at these things, and I pick up the chisel, and I say, oh wow, there's letters in here. I see a BPH. BPH. PH, oh, Phoenix! It says Phoenix, ha ha ha. I hand it to our artifact cataloger, and I start looking at the other tools, and all of a sudden he says, yes, it's Phoenix. What? It says Phoenix? He actually spent the time and cleaned the mud off of it very quickly. Did not have the patience, clearly. And it said SB. Landed in Quebec City on June 8th. Everybody knew cholera because they'd heard the reports from Europe. Everybody was dying. Just like, and very similar to COVID. Right, we can all have this flashback. And so everybody was dying there. They knew it was only a matter of time until it made it to North America. And when it arrived in Quebec, everybody on board, lots of people had already died, people were sick, and everybody fled. But what cholera is, it's a bacteria in the water, and once you've ingested it, it only takes a few hours in some cases, but maybe up to 24 hours until you start getting the runs. And in the time, right, that you don't just go to the hospital and get an IV drip, you die. And so, anyway, so the Carrick lands in Quebec, and everybody flees and jumps on board the next boat available, which is a steamboat called the Voyageur, which takes them from Quebec City to Montreal, June 9th, not surprisingly, outbreak of cholera in Montreal. And then from there, we know that a man named John Larned, who was native to Albany, was in Montreal right around June 13th, and went and visited a cholera hospital, which had sprung up 4 days after that first case. And after visiting this hospital, he was heading home to Albany. How do you get to Albany from Montreal? You take a steamboat from Lake Champlain, which you board in St. John's, or St. John's de Richelieu, and you travel to Whitehall, the very southern terminus of the lake, where John Larned, who boarded Phoenix 2 in St. John's on June 14th, was dying by 11 a.m. on June 15th of clearly cholera. When he landed in Whitehall on June 15th at 11 a.m., everybody fled because they were all afraid of catching cholera. Little did they know they'd probably already caught it. The captain, whose name was Gideon Lathrop, stayed on board and comforted John Larned as he died. They called the doctor who came on board, and there were the only two people left, as the first person in the United States died of cholera on board of Phoenix 2. And from there, if you don't know, cholera actually continued to spread through the waterways on canal boats and steamboats, to New York City, and then through the western rivers as well, all the way to New Orleans. Lots more deaths, all because of this water highway, back to that water highway. But so just to see how detrimental it was, between July and November, 3,500 deaths from cholera happened in New York City alone, which New York City was not nearly the size it is now, so that was a huge, huge destruction for that population. And so this is the quote from Captain Gideon Lathrop. Mr. John Larned of Troy, New York, was seized with the cholera the night when going from St. John's to Whitehall. He died soon after the boat reached her dock. And this is in a report from Alicia Harris on basically the outbreak of cholera in the United States. So, very important vessel. And yet, here we are, 200 years later, we didn't even know it was there. We didn't know which one it was. Didn't know anything about its sinking. So, very important vessel, an unremarkable end. It did end up being scuttled. Why were the rocks there? Maybe you've been wondering this whole time. The other ones didn't have rocks, by the way. Well, we think, we don't know, we don't have reports, but we think that the steamboat worker, the shipyard workers, brought it over to a local quarry after the engine had been removed, the hatches were open, dumped a bunch of rocks in it, and then sank it purposely in place to create a platform or a dock. And it probably lasted for a couple of decades, and then the sides fell out, and we found the sides. They're there. We haven't done a great job, as much reporting on them, but they're there. And and then probably they replaced it with a new dock. but very unremarkable, and we didn't even know it was there. But that is the end of my talk. I'll leave 10 minutes for questions. I want to thank all these wonderful people and Chris for helping us many, many times in the field. There's Kevin Chrisman up there, my co-director for this project. Thank you very much. What questions may I answer? Yes, please.
How did you know that the barbershop was here?
Okay, well, the interior thing is actually my current study. So because we found the chisel, we had to collect a bunch of artifacts. This is a PhD student's worst nightmare, because now I have a whole other dissertation that I could do after this. So now I'm doing that. And so what we have been finding is, well, there was a publication about Phoenix 1, because it was the second steamboat on the lake. And so it had the publication of the arrangement inside Phoenix 1. So I'm taking a leap here and assuming if it was made to resemble its predecessor in every way, well, Phoenix 2 is going to have the same. And so we have the layout of Phoenix 1 written down, so I've just plopped it onto Phoenix 2 and I'm hoping that's the same. But because I have the engine room of Phoenix 2, I do have the locations, and they're all in relative terms. They don't, I think they have dimensions for maybe the cabins, but they don't have dimensions for anything else. And so I've looked at a couple of other layouts of different steamboats of the time, so to get an idea of what those might have looked like. But that's why I'm saying they're pretty conjectural, but they are in terms of relative places. I know that this is forward of that, this is forward of that, so in that sense they're probably pretty accurate. Thanks. Yeah, good question. Yes, please.
So have the other wrecks in that general area been identified, or are they waiting for the next PhD students?
You answer your own question. Yeah, so I think a little closer to the shipyard over time they have either been dragged out into deeper water or just pulverized. I don't think they've been pulverized. I think they've been moved. And so I know that there are a couple left out just off of Pine Point. The United States and Canada are still there. Possible topics of future research for myself, actually, and any other PhD student who might want to do it. But the Adirondack is another one that's out there as well. That one was dragged out. We know about that one. That was studied a little bit. Do you know more information? You guys studied that a little bit.
Yeah, but I mean, well before my time.
Okay,
Back
okay.
in the 80s.
Yeah.
It was actually it was looked at as part of the Champlain 2 documentation.
Okay.
With the Baldwin,
Yeah, yeah.
Champlain 2 being some just across the lake here.
Right. Okay. So it's been very preliminarily studied, I think, but there is definitely opportunity to look at more detail on that one. And as for the others, I don't know if they're still there personally. There might be people who
There's
do.
one that you can see just to the north of the shipyard when the water goes real low.
Is that the Adirondack? I think that might be.
I know, there's a red can on it, and
Yeah.
so it's like right there.
That one I believe is actually just a barge.
Oh,
Is
okay.
that-
There's both a barge and a tugboat there.
Tugboat, yes. Yeah,
And
okay.
the ferry company still has an active dry dock there.
Yeah, I know that. That's where they work on their boats, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, I had a question over here. Yes.
Why would the barber shop be so big?
Okay, that might be my fault. The barber shop was more than just where they got their haircut, but it's also the only thing I have in that space, so I just filled the whole space with it. There's probably other things going on. I think there was probably more socialization spaces. There is probably a purser's area. I don't have where that is, so it could have been there too. So yeah, apologies. That's mine. Good question. Yeah.
Did you learn much about the technology of building?
Of build, yeah, oh yeah. So, yeah, I didn't get into that. I mentioned my research question and then just talked about Phoenix because I could go on for 3 hours about this. But yes, what we learned, now I will backtrack because we have to have a visual for this, but I'll do it quickly. Okay, here we go. So, now that we know where Act 2 is, no spoilers, it's Phoenix 2. If you look at it, you can see that the framing timbers, right, these ones that go this way, way more of them than the others. Okay? What we have concluded, essentially, is that in 1820, they were much more concerned with the weight of the engine and not yet to the point where they were doing anything they could to get a faster boat. They were still worried, they still wanted structure and strength a little bit more than speed. They still wanted speed, but it wasn't quite the priority in 1820. It was still, steamboats were still enough of a novelty on their own, and were still way faster and could keep a schedule better than a sailboat. It was really only the 1830s that pushed steamboat builders into thinking about how can we get the fastest hull in addition to fastest engines, right? So I haven't even talked about engines, but just hull design alone really influenced how the shipwrights were building things. They wanted speed. And so Rec 3 and Rec 4 gave us clues to that, because what we found was the frames, first of all, you can see there's much more space between them, right? And they are scaled, and you can see they're thin. From the top, what we call the sided dimension, when you look straight down at it, that sided dimension is really narrow compared to the kind of chunky ones on Phoenix 2. Burlington's really thin, but they were very deep. And overall, that's less volume, but still strength, right? So they still have the strength, but they reduce some volume, which reduces some weight, which allows the hull to be faster, also longer, more passengers, more profit. Longer also helped to reduce the draft a little bit, because it's spread out over a longer space with less weight. So we reduce the draft, we reduce the drag, we get a little faster. And so all of these things were going into Burlington. That's the slightly earlier one, 1837. 1838, Whitehall. So Burlington, I should say, was, oh gosh, now I forget. Was it built at Shelburne Shipyard? I think so. Yes. Yeah, I think it was built at Shelburne Shipyard. I think it was the first one by the Champlain Transportation Company built at Shelburne Shipyard. Their previous boat was built up in St. Albans. Whitehall, however, was being built by a competitor in Whitehall, New York, which is why it's called Whitehall. And he was basically waiting to be bought out by the Champlain Transportation Company, so he started building this boat, and they're like, oh, we don't want competition, here's some money. So literally that was his plan. He did it 3 times. It worked 3 times. Different stories. So Peter Comstock was building Whitehall, and he started it, but the Champlain Transportation Company finished it. I can't remember the timeline of when exactly they took over, but different shipwrights working on 2 different boats within a year of each other. Burlington had its own things going on, but Whitehall, what we found, very interestingly, so you can see these long engine bed timbers that I've mentioned, right? Very different shapes too, from Phoenix. They were basically spanned the whole hull. They were huge. There were, at some points, 3 12-inch square timbers stacked on top of each other. So they were, I mean, with a couple things in between, I think I have a total height of 43 inches for where these engine bed timbers were off the bottom of the hull. But so we can kind of tell where the engine was based on how big they get in that section. And where that engine is, you can see sort of with this picture. If you look here, the frames are pretty closely spaced together, but if you look towards the end, they're further. So the shipwrights were really, really experimenting with as minimal frames as they could. Not only were they, again, narrow and deep to reduce volume, but they were kind of put together much more tightly where the engine was, where they were worried about strength. And then at the ends, especially on this very long boat that would have been prone to hogging for heavy ends, right? They reduced the weight by spacing the frames much further apart. I think it was something like, I did a study at one point, I think the centers were 21 inches out here, they went down to 16. So 5 inches difference in terms of the spacing of the frames. Significant change, and then very, very regular for a section. You know, it was 21 inches, 21 inches, 21 inches, 21 inches, and then there was a transition period, I don't remember, it was something like 18, and then there's 16 inches, 16 inches, 16 inches. So very, very clear, and then just to top it all off, by the time they got to A. Williams, not only have they added engine bed timbers, they've found that longitudinal means less weight, but just as much strength, and they've got almost no frames on this thing. I mean, it was a much smaller boat, so it's a little bit hard to compare, but way later they've got, on each side, up to 7 engine bed timbers parallel, whereas on Phoenix 2, they only have 2. And so they've added over the years, so that's another thing we found. So yeah, quite a lot, actually. They've changed a lot over the years. Sorry, you do have a question over there, yeah.
These have been underwater now 150 plus years. How long before that they completely rot away? Or I mean, it's amazing that they're still there.
Yeah, it is amazing. How long? Definitely can't answer that, but I could say that in Lake Champlain we're really lucky because this is a wonderful site for preservation of wood. It's cold, it's dark, it's fresh water. So we don't have anything that eats the wood. And the cold water is kind of like a fridge. keeps things longer. It will eventually, potentially rot away, but not within any of our lifetimes and many, many generations beyond us. So it's, especially where Phoenix 2 was covered with rocks, it had created an anaerobic environment. You could see, I mean, it was hard corners, like sharp corners of the wood was still preserved so perfectly, which makes you wonder, was it even rotten when it sank? But probably enough to sink it. But yeah, they're going to last a long time. Their main threats for these ones, they're so shallow, so they get ice, waves. Also, it's a working marina, so boats. We had a fair number of bass fishermen on us. So, you know, there's boating activity around all the time. And of course, zebra mussels. And that was one of our big challenges, was recording accurate details because the zebra mussels coat the sides. It's hard to get, you know, precise measurements. But they'll last longer than memory of, I don't know, I couldn't tell you, 1,000 years?
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know for sure. I don't have to be around, luckily. You can't fact check me. Sorry, I'm not sure who's first coming.
Were the steam engines reused?
Yes.
Or melted down? I mean, were
They were reused. So Phoenix 2 I now went through 2, and its first one was from Phoenix 1. They managed to salvage it.
Really?
Yeah, and reuse it on Phoenix 2, and then it had a second one built for it in, I think, 1832, that was built specifically for that, but then that one was then used on a steamboat to Great Lakes. So they did definitely reuse steam
I
engines.
assume the engines themselves were getting improved.
They were, yeah, and so that's why it did have a refit in I think it was 1832, because it was getting outpaced by the other guys. So as they improved designs, they would replace, but it's also, you know, it balanced expense versus competition, right? Yeah.
Why was the documentation for the early experiments so poor? Did they actually document it and those documents were lost, or were there some other reasons why?
They may have jotted down a couple of notes and then just went ahead and built something. Anybody a shipwright? What I know about shipwrights is they don't really need things written down. They could just do it by eye. I mean, if you're designing a steamboat, maybe you'd want to write a couple things down, but maybe not everything, because if you've been building ships all your life, you just know how things go together and you don't need to write it down, and it's just more time to write it down. So there may have been notes, and there are some notes of some of the earlier experiments. There's notes about Clermont. There's a memoir of steamboats by a French engineer, Maristier, that has wonderful notes about different steamboats, especially on the Hudson River. But Lake Champlain maybe didn't have as many notes. And also, there was a building where one of the captains who ran the Champlain Transportation Company for a while had all of his documents that burned. So if there were ever notes, those ones are gone for this particular place. Sorry, I think I had a question back there first. Yeah.
So did you say it took 1 day to get down the whole lake?
Yeah.
So were there cabins?
Phoenix 2 took, it changed over time, because when I got its second engine was faster. But I think it took a little over a day the first time around. But Burlington, I think by the time Burlington was built, it was 18 hours. So it was not a whole day. I think it was, yeah, something like 26, 28 hours for Phoenix 2, and then something like 18 hours. And then I don't know what I don't remember what the final one was. I don't know how fast A. Williams could do it. Yeah, yes, sorry.
So of all the steamships that were on the lake,
Sure, catastrophic sinkings. That's the Phoenix 1 and Champlain 2. That might be it. There were about 53 or something, over 50 passenger steamboats overall.
so Lake's pretty safe.
Lake's pretty safe. Yeah, these boats were pretty safe, shockingly.
And compared to the Western River steamboats, they were.
Yeah, oh yes, they were, yeah. So you hear a lot about these, thank you for that. There's a lot of those steamboat explosions you hear about in the 1800s. And that's because of the different engine styles. So on Lake Champlain, they always had low pressure boilers. Because it was a lake with minimal current and then lots of room, and so they could have kind of deeper hulls and didn't have to fight a current the whole time. Whereas on like the Mississippi or the Western Rivers, they had very, very, very tiny drafts. They had to fit an engine into something that could have a draft of no more than 4 feet to get through the Mississippi, and had to fight a massive current the whole time, so it had to be super powerful. So they figured out something called a high pressure engine, and high pressure, well, boom. So they had a lot more, and then they also had lots of like races and stuff where they push and push and push until boom. So yeah, lots of explosions out there, and no explosions on Lake Champlain.
So, you did a lot of research on the hulls. Were you
Yes.
able to get any research on the wheels?
Actually, that's another good question. So, a little bit, not a ton, frankly, for Phoenix 2, but what we found on Rec 4 was, and I don't have a picture of it, but not on this presentation, we found, it was like a triangular structure, but the structure's, I forget now, 18 feet tall, so very, very big. And we found it was a support structure for the paddle wheel guard. So if you looked at the side, you wouldn't just see like the naked paddle wheel. There was kind of a box, a circular box that housed the paddle wheel inside. And to hold to part of the structure of that box was this triangle thing. And we found one of those. And so we have that recorded as well. Unfortunately, it's just that. And we don't have the paddle wheels, which probably were repurposed somehow or another, so they're completely gone. But recently, the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum and George and other people have found the Phoenix 1's paddle wheel.
Oh.
And so there's some coming up research because this is pretty recent. When was that found?
During the pandemic.
Yeah.
So I think it was
21, okay. But yeah, that is very deep, so that's a lot of effort to record. But some good models online for that too, so you can check those out. Any other questions?
I got one.
Yeah.
When you coming back, so I get some more stuff.
Hopefully soon. Yeah, hopefully soon.
Work to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. We got lots more steamboats out there. Oh, there's another question.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time to come out.